Now, for more on the talks between the United States and Iran, we're joined today by Dr. Robert Lawrence, professor of English and Turkic Studies at Dongduk Women's University. Professor Lawrence, thanks for coming on today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, strain appears to have emerged on the very first day of talks in Switzerland with President Donald Trump and Iranian negotiator publicly trading warnings. What do you make of the latest meeting?
Well, obviously, there's a great deal of tension around the talks. Iran is threatening to walk out because continued violence in Lebanon, claiming that Israel is the aggressor and it violates Article 1 of the MOU. They were also displeased with some of the rhetoric coming from President Trump's social media, and likewise, President Trump was displeased with some of the rhetoric coming from President Pezeshkian and Speaker Ghalibaf. So, while Vice President Vance is keeping a pretty optimistic tone for the time being, the reality is that there's a situation where both teams ostensibly think that they have the upper hand in the negotiation. The U.S. would probably prefer to get some concrete steps made to show the public that are a little bit less ambiguous than the MOU, which has come under some pretty heavy criticism from all sides domestically. Iran, I think, on the flip side, is kind of determined to shape the narrative and not be rushed into anything. In fact, I think it probably wants to drag out the negotiations because it thinks its leverage will increase as the U.S. midterms get closer. So it's going to focus on and contest every single detail and concentrate on the information space. And this was evident this morning when the Iranian side refused to take part in the photo op. Before today's meeting. So, I don't expect there to be any major breakthroughs in today's talks, or if there are any breakthroughs, then I think the details of those breakthroughs will be contested in the information front, similar to how the 14-point MOU has been contested since it's gone public.
Right, and the most difficult issue in the negotiations is Iran's nuclear program, right? And under the preliminary ceasefire, the 14-point peace deal, Iran will not develop nuclear weapons in exchange for sanctions relief, but Trump has insisted that the deal would ensure that Iran will never buy, develop, or produce a nuclear weapon. And some analysts say that this preliminary deal fails short of that goal. What's your take on this?
I think it depends on how you determine, the utility of the MOU. The first sentence of Article 8 of the MOU says that Iran reaffirms that it will not develop or procure nuclear weapons. Well, that's really nothing more than a reiteration of the promise that they made when they signed the NTP, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that was back in 1970. So, given the non-compliance, that the history of non-compliance Iran has with the IAEA, the MOU's critics don't find this to be sufficient, for obvious reasons. However, the rest of Article 8 implies that the details of the nuclear program, such as further enrichment or the stockpiled uranium, are to be dealt with in the negotiations over the next 60 days. So as the MOU stands right now, it changes pretty much nothing, to be honest. But if you look at it as one step of many in a sequential trust-building, kind of framework, then the results of the process will indicate if the president has achieved his goal, well, not the steps. But if we look at it as it is right now, it doesn't really change the discussion at all. It hasn't moved it anywhere.
And another key issue is the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranian military says it's closed the strait again, but the U.S. military says traffic continues to flow. So does this suggest the ceasefire is becoming more fragile?
Well, right, like you said, the two sides are giving very different information about the conditions of traffic through the strait. Just a few hours ago, President Trump issued some very strong threats regarding the condition in the strait. I think that the ceasefire has always been fragile at best. We've repeatedly seen the use of force come into place since the ceasefire has come into place. And if we include the Lebanese front into this discussion, then there's really never been a ceasefire. I think it's a bit of posturing on part of the Iranians. They think they have leverage, and they don't think the U.S. has the political will to re-engage in kinetic operations. Even this morning, Iranian officials openly called President Trump's threats empty and pretty much meaningless. So going into the negotiations, I think that they're trying to show that they have cards, and it was also likely a response to some of the rhetoric I mentioned before. For the U.S., this could potentially be a deal breaker. much like the conditions in Lebanon could be a deal breaker for Iran. So, if the ceasefire rests on the implementation of the MOU, then both countries are arguing that the other is already in violation of the agreement, which, increases the probability of kinetic military operations resuming.
Right. Like you just mentioned, what's happening in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah are complicating the negotiations. How do you see the situation in Lebanon unfolding from here?
I'm not very hopeful in Lebanon right now, to be honest. Both Israel and Hezbollah are arguing that the other initiated the breach in the ceasefire. That was supposed to go into effect on Friday, but since then we've seen deaths on both sides, and fighting has pretty much been constant. Neither of these sides were part to the negotiations, and they're expected to adhere to the deal. And while the U.S. has a great deal of influence in Israel, Israel is its own country, and it has its own domestic political realities that make agreeing to an unpopular idea very complicated. And since October 7th, if there's one thing that the Israeli people have been, in pretty much full agreement is that, they want to combat anything close to their border. So the idea of fighting Hezbollah is not unpopular in Israel, and imposing this ceasefire on them has not been a popular idea in Israel, and they have elections coming up. So, even though the MOU is mentioning Lebanon, is also quite ambiguous. In Article 1, it talks about ensuring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon by both nations and their allies. There's a lot to unpack there, and it's very open to interpretation. So both the U.S. and Iran are already crying foul on the activities of the other allies in Lebanon, and there doesn't really seem to be a lot of signs of the situation improving. And, in the last couple of days, we've also seen President Trump talk about maybe getting Syrian forces involved in combating Hezbollah. And I think that'll further complicate the situation. So, unfortunately, like I said before, I'm not very optimistic with Lebanon right now.
I see. I guess we'll have to see how that plays out. All right, Professor Lawrence, thank you so much for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you.